I'm standing today in this chamber and I'm pleased to speak for the first time as the re-elected member of Parliament for Yorkton-Malvo. And I, thank you, and my fellow Saskatchewan caucus colleagues thank all of our constituents for painting the province of Saskatchewan completely blue. Bill C-3 actually mirrors Bill C-98, an act to amend the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Act and the Canadian Border Services Agency Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. As we all know, the bill took so long to introduce that it wasn't passed prior to the 2019 federal election. This legislation proposes to repurpose and rename the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP to the Public Complaints and Review Commission. Under its new name, the Commission will also be responsible for reviewing civilian complaints against the Canadian Border Services Agency, and this bill would ensure that all Canadian law enforcement agencies do have an oversight body. Canadians expect effective oversight of federal law enforcement agencies. The Liberals made a promise to do this in 2015. During the previous mandate, the Liberal government took so long to act on this issue that Bill C-98 failed to be passed prior to the 2019 election. The former Privy Council Office Chief Mel Cathay had been hired to conduct an independent report and provide his recommendations in June 2017, which he did. However, it was only because of an access to information request by CBC News that the Parliament even became aware of this report. For 2 years, the government and the then and now no longer Public Safety Minister from Saskatchewan sat on that report. We who served in the previous Parliament were counting down the days and nights until the session came to a close, and then at the last possible moment, this rather straightforward and simple but essential legislation was finally introduced. Why did it take the previous majority Liberal government 3.5 years to draft and introduce Bill C-98 to this House? In the 11th hour, it was too late to deal with such a critical promise that impacted public safety. The Liberals' poor management and bad decision-making impacted RCMP officers who had to be deployed and dedicated to dealing with illegal border crossings. They were pulled from other details, from monitoring returned ISIS fighters, tackling organized crime. They were pulled from rural detachments where the RCMP is already short-staffed and dealing with an increase in rural crime. The claim that there are more police available in rural Canada is not true, a statement made and not followed through on. When the Liberal majority government was ineptly unable to keep an election promise at the 11th hour so as to not appear to have broken even more promises, it meant an even longer wait through the whole election process, through the weeks of delay before the House was finally reconvened and called back by the Prime Minister, to sit just before Christmas for a short time, only to go into the winter break, and finally, well, here we finally are today, a second attempt to get the job done with Bill C-3. This government has been plagued by inefficiency and lack of foresight since the beginning of its first mandate, further hamstrung by one ethical breach after another, through brazen attitudes of entitlement to the foolish boldness of demanding and coercing our independent justice system and principled people to bow down to executive power. Just this past week, we have seen the frightening fallout of this government putting their friends ahead of good governance. A violent man sentenced to life in prison in 2006 for viciously murdering his wife was granted day parole in the fall of 2019. His case manager indicated a moderate risk of offending, and he was to avoid relationships but could have encounters with women as long as it was strictly sexual. As a result, a young woman lost her life. Who in their right mind would create the environment for any woman to be put in harm's way like this? Ex-parole board commissioner David Blackburn has stated that such a condition is unbelievable. This Liberal government has to take responsibility for a foolish decision it made in 2015 to not renew any parole board appointees, purely a political decision that removed all historical experience from the board and replaced them all through the Privy Council with Liberal appointees. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the desk will be pleased to hear that I'm going to be splitting my time with the member from Kootenay, Columbia. Since then, there has been over a 25% increase in the awarding of day paroles in Canada. This is ridiculous. Canadians have no faith that an internal inquiry will get to the bottom of the incompetence that falls on this government. An external inquiry of the National Parole Board must take place. This government doesn't have credibility in dealing with its own self-serving, intentional mistakes. As well, Mr. Speaker, we know the delay in bringing forward this legislation was not due in any way to so many consultations. As a matter of fact, again and again, we heard from stakeholders that they were not consulted. And from what I've heard today on the floor, that hasn't changed. This bill makes changes to the Canadian Border Service Agency, and yet the Customs and Immigration Union were never contacted. Another blatant inconsistency by this government. On one end, no consultation. On the other, virtual signaling of setting up advisory councils for our veterans that did nothing other than give a platform for photo ops and the appearance of consultation before the reveal. The fact that this Liberal government could not be bothered to consult the biggest stakeholders, the union representatives, the CBSA frontline workers, says it's not about the workers. It appears the Liberals feel they can pick and choose which unions they're going to give special treatment to, while others are totally ignored. We will work with this government in the interest of the principles of this bill, but rest assured we want to make sure that the people impacted are part of this committee review process. We want to ensure the proper committee time is taken to look at the changes to the RCMP Act and the CBSA Act, to make sure we're doing a service to the people who will be impacted by them, whether it's on a public complaints process or other elements. But Mr. Speaker, as good as this policy is, it needs good government to implement it, not a government consistently mired in scandal that it loses track of its responsibilities, and then concerns about its re-election attempts to rush this legislation through irresponsibly. Mr. Speaker, not a government that's so out of touch that it fails to consult with the Canadians that would be impacted. This government's approach demonstrates a complete lack of accountability, care, and respect for Canadians. There is unrest, Mr. Speaker, across Western Canada that must not be ignored. And I would warn, must no longer be fueled by intentional actions that encourage that unrest instead of building consensus and recognizing and celebrating healthy interdependence across our amazing country. Our nation, all people of Canada, deserve a government that legislates responsibly, respectfully, and with the best interests of all Canadians in mind. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the day we form that government.
Thank you. Questions and comments? Qu'est-ce commentaire? The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I remember when we came back in 2015, and I'm sure the member herself will recall, there was legislation that was carried over from when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, where Stephen Harper had actually ultimately had his legislative agenda, and then towards the very end, a number of bills he was not able to get through because of the time in which he actually introduced them. Liberal ministers reviewed that legislation and on occasion brought forward that legislation. My question to the member is, would she not agree that when you get a session or a parliamentary session coming to an end, that there is benefit in terms of having legislation being debated all the way to the end, and then it provides the opportunity, whether it's the same party in government or a new party taking government, that it's a good idea to take the legislation and continue it on. And that's how I see this particular piece of legislation. I suspect, given the comments from all members of this House, that it is a good piece of legislation and it's a good starting point, and we only owe it this starting point that we have today because it was brought in when it was brought in the last Parliament.
For Yorkton Melville.
Mr. Speaker, yes, we've agreed around this table that this is good legislation and it needs to come forward. However, the Liberals made a promise in 2015 that this would happen, and it didn't even hit the floor of this place until we were going out the door. And there was studies being done that were hidden. We wouldn't have found out about what was going on unless the CBC actually did a request for information to know what was happening. So if we're working on this as a House, and suddenly this legislation is brought forward at the end, I question the motives behind why that was done. I agree that there are times when you get that legislation out there so that at least it's in the eyes of the House. However, as we know, no consultation was done, and that came through loud and clear from the people who are impacted by this legislation. So that says to me, unfortunately, that still hasn't happened, and we're here in the House discussing it again, and it's unfortunate that they weren't didn't have the opportunity to speak to this, the actual people that it impacts.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for her comments. My question, it comes, I hope you'll beg my forgiveness, but I am a new member of Parliament for the NDP. I'm very proud to be a member of Parliament for Alberta, for the NDP, and what I don't understand is why this has taken so long to come forward, because as you know, the NDP have been asking for this legislation for many years, certainly back to when Stephen Harper was our Prime Minister, and I'm just wondering, you know, how can the member talk about the delays when the delays began under, of course, a conservative government? I'd like to just read a quote. It is a basic principle of good human rights practice that agencies that have detention and police powers should be subject to independent oversight, and the CBSA has both. It is time that the CBSA is held accountable through an independent and impartial process. What I'd like to ask the minister is, in addition to why it took so long, is also, you know, will the Conservative Party, knowing that this is important, knowing that Canadians want to see this legislation, will they be supporting this legislation?
Member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your question, and welcome to the House. I actually ran in a nomination in your riding many years ago. It's very good, I agree, that we come to a consensus on this, and that is very much what I am sensing in the House, that it is something that we need to move forward on. Canadians expect it, and it needs to be done, and I look forward to it getting to committee and getting the proper oversight there going forward.
We have time for a short question and response. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Provencher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's the first time I rise in this House this session, and I just want to thank the good constituents of my riding, Provencher, for re-electing me and showing their confidence in me for the third time. I want to thank the member for her speech, and you know, I also want to recognize the very world-class officers we have both in the CBSA and the RCMP. And I'm confused why the Liberal government would increase their workload by allowing all the illegal migrants to come across the border in my riding, but also in Quebec and Roxham Road, and also some in British Columbia. If she has any idea why the Liberals would even want to do that and tax our good officers any more than they have been.
Member for Yorkton Melville.
I thank my colleague for the question. This is definitely an issue that was raised right across our country as the illegal immigrants were coming into Canada. The very fact that it was allowed in the first place is questionable. I'll be very polite there. The second thing is that, yes, it caused a great deal of dissension within our ranks of our border service individuals as well as the RCMP. The expectations that they take this on when already pretty limited in their ability to succeed at the jobs that they have, creating more stress, quite honestly, for them in the workplace, in a situation where, for me, as a person who goes across that border and deals with people, you want people who are prepared and ready to do their job and not be stretched to the nth degree.